Rice seems too ordinary to matter. Yet this quiet grain helped build cities, feed empires, cross oceans, shape famine and survival, and influence the fate of millions. Once its hidden history begins to unfold, everyday food never looks the same again. There are some things in history that look too small, too common, and too ordinary to deserve real attention. Rice is one of those things. It looks simple and familiar, too humble to belong in the same sentence as empire, diplomacy, political power, or the rise of cities. And yet, half of the people on this planet eat at least a bowl of it every single day. This quiet grain has fed civilizations from Southeast Asia to the Caribbean, from China to West Africa. Welcome to English Mindwave. Before going further, please subscribe to the channel and support English Mindwave so more stories like this can keep coming. What makes rice so fascinating is the contrast itself. Gold looks valuable. Oil looks strategic. Armies, borders, and trade routes look powerful. Rice does not. But civilization cannot survive on spectacle. Before a kingdom can dream of conquest, it has to feed people. Before a state can tax, govern, or organize labor, it has to solve hunger. In much of the world, rice became one of the quiet answers to that problem. This grain did far more than fill bowls. It supported settlement, shaped farming life, entered local markets and labor systems, and stood behind the growth of cities and social order. In many cultures, rice became too important to remain just a crop. It entered sacred stories, seasonal traditions, and symbolic life. In Vietnam, one legend says rice gods once gave people giant grains, large enough that one grain could feed a person for a day. When gratitude faded, the rice shrank, and people had to work for it. Whether taken as myth or moral memory, the message is clear. Rice was never trivial. It was life itself. That is why this is not simply the history of food. It is the history of one of civilization's quiet foundations. Rice helped move human communities from fragile survival toward stability, population growth, and social complexity. Once rice is seen that way, the next question becomes impossible to resist. Where did it begin? And how did something so ordinary become important enough for civilizations to fight over its origin? The beginning of rice is ancient, but not simple. It is a story where science, history, and national pride become tangled together. Wild rice existed long before rice agriculture transformed civilization. Some of the earliest widely accepted evidence for rice as a food source points to the Yangtze River Valley in China around 12,000 BC. But this early rice was probably gathered with other foods such as nuts and acorns. Rice was present, but not yet dominant. The true turning point came later. Wild rice naturally drops its grain when it ripens, which is terrible for stable farming. At some point, after generations of observation and selection, people began relying on rice with a non-shattering mutation. In simple terms, the grain stayed attached long enough to be harvested. That tiny change altered everything. Once rice became reliably harvestable, fields could be managed, surpluses stored, settlements stabilized, populations increased, and labor organized. Then the debate begins. China has powerful claims supported by archaeology, geography, and early evidence. India also has ancient ties to rice and old remains that have fueled intense argument. Over time, two major forms of Asian rice became especially important: Japonica and Indica. They developed different traits and food cultures, yet both belong to Oryza sativa and share the same crucial non-shattering gene. One influential genetic study pointed toward the Pearl River Delta in southern China as an origin point, with rice later spreading and crossbreeding toward India. Even Korea entered the debate with early origin claims that were later widely challenged. Rice is argued over because it is civilizational. Standing near its beginning means standing near one of the earliest foundations of settled life. And once the argument over origins begins to settle, even partially, the real power of rice appears somewhere else. In the astonishing way it entered ordinary life and began shaping culture from the inside. A grain becomes truly civilizational when it stops being just something grown in a field and starts becoming part of how a society eats, believes, remembers, celebrates, and survives. That is what rice did. It entered kitchens, rituals, myths, markets, and social habits. One of the earliest signs of this transformation appears in China around 1000 BC, when zhou, or congee, became one of the oldest known rice dishes. It may seem too simple to matter historically, but simple food often carries deep intelligence. Congee stretched limited rice supplies, reduced waste, and helped communities endure difficult times. Rice also moved into sacred imagination. In Chinese tradition, staple crops were tied to divine order and agricultural wisdom through figures like Shen Nong. In Japan, rice entered sacred stories linked to the gods. In Thailand and Laos, rice goddesses reflected the belief that grain was tied to life, fertility, and protection. In Tibet, among the Miao, in the Philippines, in Vietnam, and elsewhere, rice appeared in stories as something gifted, guarded, or carried into human life through forces greater than hunger. At the same time, rice became more diverse in daily use. India developed kheer, turning rice into sweetness and ceremony. Japan gave rise to narisushi, where rice played a role in preservation. Across Southeast Asia, rice moved into flour and fermentation, creating noodle traditions that became central to regional cuisines. The Mon peoples played a major role in spreading rice cultivation, irrigation knowledge, and noodle traditions into areas that would later become Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, and southern India. That older world still survives in dishes such as Kanam Jin, Numbanchok, Bun, and Mohinga. Rice also became more intimate through its diversity. There are roughly 120,000 varieties in the world. And even the age of stored rice affects the way it cooks. Rice did not remain confined to Asia. Through India, it moved west into Persia. And after Alexander's conquests, it entered the Greek world more visibly. At first, it was sometimes used more for flour, desserts, or beer than as an everyday staple. But over time, rice entered Middle Eastern cuisines more deeply, especially through dishes like pilaf. Pilaf is more than a recipe. It is a map of exchange, carrying the memory of Central Asia, Persian influence, Muslim trade routes, and later the culinary worlds that helped shape biryani in India. Rice did not merely travel. It translated itself. And just when the story seems firmly rooted in Asia, it opens again in a way that changes everything, because one of the most important chapters in the history of rice belongs not to Asia alone, but also to Africa, and later to the Atlantic world, shaped by slavery and forced migration. Around 1500 BC, a separate domestication of rice emerged in West Africa, in the Niger River region of present-day Nigeria. This was not simply Asian rice in another environment. It was a distinct species of African rice, shaped by different ecological pressures and human knowledge. It matured more quickly, tolerated poor soils, and adapted well to harsh conditions and delta landscapes. That means the story of rice is not a single line radiating from one center. It is also a story of parallel intelligence and separate agricultural breakthroughs. In West Africa, rice became part of social and political life. It supported communities, labor systems, and larger societies connected to Volta Niger peoples, and later Yoruba worlds. It stood beneath the material life of major West African civilizations such as Mali and Songhai, and urban centers like Ile-Ife. This deeper background gives modern dishes a stronger meaning. Jollof rice, so widely debated today, belongs to a much older rice tradition. Tomatoes arrived later through Portuguese traders, but the rice culture beneath the dish was already rooted in the region. Then the story crosses the Atlantic under devastating conditions. Through slavery, African rice culture moved into the Caribbean and the Americas. Enslaved Africans did not arrive as empty labor. They carried agricultural knowledge, technical skill, and lived familiarity with wetlands, water control, planting cycles, and processing methods. Some accounts even speak of hidden grains being carried across the ocean. Rice became important in Jamaica, Trinidad, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, and the United States. In Peru, later dishes such as arroz chofa reflected additional Chinese influence. In Brazil, Portuguese white rice traditions existed alongside older red rice traditions, connected to West African heritage. In the United States, Carolina rice became central to the colonial economy, and rice culture spread through Georgia and later Louisiana. Thomas Jefferson became fascinated by rice and tried to import superior varieties from Italy, Vietnam, Sumatra, and West Africa. Yet beneath these elite ambitions stood a deeper truth. African expertise remained essential. After the Louisiana Purchase, African red rice knowledge continued shaping Southern food culture. Nowhere is that clearer than in New Orleans. Jambalaya and gumbo are not just dishes. They are layered records of empire, migration, adaptation, and endurance. After following rice through origins, culture, trade, and forced migration, the final lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Rice was never only about food. Whenever survival depends on a staple, that staple eventually becomes part of politics, legitimacy, and the moral test of power. This is where the story feels closest to the modern world. Hunger is never just biological. It becomes fear, pressure, anger, and instability. A government may speak in the language of law, reform, growth, or national destiny. But if ordinary people cannot secure the food that keeps life together, those promises begin to sound fragile. Food security is not separate from political stability. In many societies, it is one of its foundations. Japan's rice riots made that painfully clear. A staple food crisis never remains only an economic issue for long, because food prices do not stay in numbers. They enter homes, bodies, and the daily anxiety of war workers, parents, and the poor. The same truth appeared with devastating force in Vietnam during the famine of 1944 to 1945. Under French colonial export systems and Japanese wartime seizure, rice became part of a catastrophe that revealed the brutal gap between power and human need. Ho Chi Minh gained support partly by promising rice and relief from starvation. That detail shows how deeply food shapes legitimacy. Hunger reaches everyone. Other modern examples reinforce the same lesson. Thailand's struggles over jasmine rice show that even now, this grain can become a question of national prestige, legal protection, and cultural ownership. Rice is still the most widely eaten food on Earth, grown in 117 countries, and modern life still depends on staple security more than many people realize. And yet, rice remains intimate. It still appears at weddings, in prayers, at funerals, in family kitchens, at street stalls, and in the quiet repetition of ordinary meals. That contrast may be the most powerful part of the story. Something so familiar has shaped cities, labor systems, trade routes, migrations, and political crises without ever demanding the attention given to kings, wars, or headlines. When this story is seen as a whole, the most striking truth is not simply that rice fed people, but that it quietly helped shape the structure of civilization itself. It moved through settlement, myth, farming, trade, migration, empire, slavery, famine, and political struggle. The deeper lesson is that the world is often shaped by quiet forces people overlook because they seem too familiar to matter. Real power often begins in the background, in the systems that sustain daily life: food, labor, water, land, and stability. That lesson still matters now. Modern life also depends on hidden foundations many people rarely stop to consider. Food security, supply chains, public trust, and social stability still shape the future more than many realize. On a personal level, this story is also a reminder to respect the ordinary things that sustain life every day. Gratitude begins there. Awareness begins there. Sometimes the strongest truths are not found in what is loud, but in what quietly keeps life together. What is one rice dish from your country or family that feels meaningful to you? Please share your answer in the comments so everyone can read different perspectives and learn from one another. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to English Mindwave to support the channel and encourage more thoughtful videos like this in the future.